Welcome to a change of venue. This is my bedroom where I have been banished for the last few days because I'm sick. It's not COVID, but it's definitely flu of some kind. But I didn't want to not put out some kind of content, and I feel better today, so I'm actually able to do this. Thank the Lord. This is a WFL snare drum from 1937. At least I think it's from 1937. It's the first year of production for WFL. It obviously does not have the original throw. It's got a pearl throw. It's got a Tama one-touch second generation muffler on it. The original muffler is gone. It does still have the original butt plate, which is cool. It's got the, what are these called? The Zephyr Lugs, I believe. It's a Duco finish, and the wear on it is fantastic. I love the way it looks. So I really just kind of want to assess the condition of the drum and see what, if anything, needs to be done to bring it up to speed as a good player. You can see the badge on that thing if it will focus. That's the first generation badge with the little harp looking thing at the top. 1937. Just a little Ludwig drum history. It seems like a lot of people get WFL and Ludwig confused. They were different companies for a while. William F. Ludwig started business in 1909 with his brother Theobald, I believe that was his name, who died unfortunately in the flu pandemic of 1918. But William F. Ludwig continued the company until 1930 when economic circumstances and the oncoming depression forced him to sell. He sold to Kahn Musical Instruments and continued working with Kahn up until 1937 when he branched out on his own and started his own company again, WFL. Up to that point, Ludwig had actually been known as Ludwig and Ludwig because of the two brothers that were in business together. And so they continued Ludwig and Ludwig under the Kahn name from 1930 on. And then sometime in the late 40s or early 50s, Kahn, who also owned Leedy Drums at the time, actually combined the two lines together and came out with Leedy and Ludwig. So you'll see some drums that are Ludwig and Ludwig, and then later they're Leedy and Ludwig. And then in 1955, they sold the Ludwig name back to William F. Ludwig, and from that point on, we've just had Ludwig drums. So that's kind of a quick history. So this is the first year. This is a 7x14 snare drum. I'm not sure what the model number is, but I'll throw it up there once I take a quick look. I should know, but I'm not remembering it at the moment. But it is a mahogany shell, perhaps mahogany poplar, I don't know. But I'm going to clean it up as best I can without doing anything dramatic to it, just to make sure it's in good functional condition as is, and take it for a spin around the block, so to speak, and then decide what, if any, further actions need to be taken to make it a good player's drum. It's not really a good collector's drum because of the modifications that have been done to it, but it's still a very cool conversation piece. And being that I'm a big Ludwig fan, it's nice to have this bit of practical Ludwig history that I can play, because I like to play my drums and not just stick them on a shelf. So anyway, let's see what this thing sounds like.
Okay, so I did the same thing with this that I do with every drum that I get, and that I took it apart, took all the parts and cleaned them really well, made sure that everything was scrubbed down, getting rid of junk and hopefully oxidation as well. I spend a lot of time with the key rods and the threads on the lugs, really working them and making sure that I get all of the stuff off the key rods. And I actually sprayed the key rods once they were clean and dry with some penetrating oil and worked them again with steel wool to get the rust off. So just rinsed everything really well, making sure that nothing's in the drain there before I unplug it. So just rinse, 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 and then we dry everything off and put the thing together.
Okay, this Tama one-touch muffler is just bent to death. They mounted this thing at an angle, so when they did that, that set this thing at an angle, which means they had to either bend this thing purposefully to get it to go flush against the top of the head, or it just got bent through usage, but I'm thinking it's probably more on purpose. That's that. The drum shell. I noticed before I took it apart, it looked like the top head and the bottom head were, they weren't totally parallel. They were sort of kind of at an angle to one another. And I wasn't sure if that was just because there's too much tension on one side or what the deal was. I didn't really investigate that further, but then once I got this thing apart, I decided to actually measure the depth of the shell. Here it is 7 1/16. Got my little tape measure here. And then here it is, at this lug, it is almost exactly 7. Here it is exactly 7. 7 1/16. 7 and a little more than 1/16 and 1/8. Yeah, so basically it's at 7 on one side and the other side is 7 1/8. So that's not a significant difference, but this drum is not square. Are any drums square? No, Joel, they're round. It's not plumb. Is that the right word? It's not plumb. We should make it plumb. Do I care? Yeah, surprisingly. Surprisingly so. Because I'm a control freak and I'm like, well, you didn't do that right. Why didn't you make that right? 85 years ago or whenever this was made. The edges are very, very smooth. Very smooth, top and bottom, which is cool. Most drums, I'm surprised, well, not surprised, I guess at some point, drums this old have spent some amount of time without heads, getting kicked around a closet or a storage space or something. And a lot of times they have notches and bumps and things in the bearing edge that just this drum doesn't have. It's very smooth, and I think it's smooth not only probably from the manufacturing, but also from 80 years of tension, of drum heads tension pressing against it. Does it bother me that it's not plumb? Yes, it does. Am I going to do anything about it? Probably not. I doubt it's going to have any kind of a noticeable impact on the sonics of the drum. I think the snare beds will have more to do with the sonic impact of the drum. Can you see those beds? Can you see that? Pretty narrow. Back in the day, snare beds were pretty narrow. And I think that probably has a bigger impact on the performance and sound of this drum than would one side being 1/8 of an inch deeper than the other side. It's all cleaned up. All the hardware's cleaned up. I'm going to put new heads on it. I'll put an Aquarian texture-coated top and the classic clear snare side. And something I think is really, really cool about this drum are these lugs, these Zephyr Lugs. And I think they're referred to as Zephyr Lugs because they were used on a line of drums, bass drums, and then I think other drums called Zephyr. And these were the lugs that were used, so people refer to them, I guess, as Zephyr Lugs. What is fascinating to me, every time I've ever seen these, I've always kind of been turned off thinking, those just look like they're stamped from metal and just, just formed into shape, pressed into a mold or something. Which is exactly what they look like, and I think that's exactly true. What is interesting to me, though, is that there are no moving parts. There's no threaded bushings that have been inserted and held with springs or nylon inserts or any kind of thing like that. This is just one piece of formed metal, and then they tapped the ends here for the key rod. And I think that is absolutely fascinating because it seems to me, one, an incredibly cheap way to make a lug. Which it probably was. This was William F. Ludwig's venture of getting back into business on his own after having sold his business to Kahn 7 years earlier. And so I think it probably was a cost-saving measure. What is interesting to me, though, is that I can find almost no information about these things failing. I have seen so many old drums that have these lugs on them, and they still have the lugs on them. This is the kind of thing that if the threads got stripped, you would have to replace the lugs. To see all these drums that still have all these lugs, and all of these lugs are still on this drum, all the threads are good. As I look online, I can't find stories of them failing. People talk about how they're durable and they've lasted all these years. I mean, 80 plus years. I just think that's super cool. And while I once thought they were really kind of ugly, made from like a sheet of metal that was formed in a mold or pressed into shape, I now think they are strangely beautiful, elegant, simple, and this also sort of brings to mind what I've seen my whole life in drum literature and I've never fully understood, And that's the idea of self-aligning lugs. 10 self-aligning lugs. This snare drum features 8 self-aligning lugs. I never knew what a self-aligning lug was, but now looking at this, that's not self-aligning. That's basically those threads are aimed whatever direction that thing's bolted on. It wants to receive the threads from that direction. Whereas a threaded insert that is inserted into a lug and held in place either with a spring or a nylon insert of some kind, that threaded bushing can move around and can line up with whatever direction the key rod's coming in. So there's a lot more variation there, whereas this has to be kind of lined up, or you are putting tension on it that you wouldn't necessarily want to be doing. So now that makes more sense to me, and I've honestly never really thought about that. After all these decades, I've never really thought about that until literally now, because this is the first non-self-aligning lug I have ever owned. So, very interesting.